I hadn't really taken the time to talk about this topic until now, because despite everything that's happened, Marathon isn't dead. In fact, as I'm recording this video, it still has a dedicated player base. Roughly 8,000 players remain active. The problem isn't that Bungie needs a dedicated player base, it needs a large one. And that's when things get complicated. Recently, Marathon became free to play for a limited time through its Open Play Week. The short version? Yes, players increased, but it wasn't the explosion Bungie was probably hoping for. Before the event, several outlets reported that Marathon had fallen significantly from its launch numbers. At launch, the game reached roughly 88,000 concurrent players on Steam. Then June arrived, Season 2 launched, the free week began, and that's the game monthly peak. Climbed back to around 40,000 concurrent players. That's not nothing. Clearly some players returned, clearly new players were curious, but it was still well below launch, and far below the Server Slam beta, which peaked at over 130,000 players. So while the promotion worked, it didn't completely change the conversation. You know what I think? I think Marathon should have been free to play from day one.
Torches! Get your torches! Pitchforks! Can't be an angry mob without pitchforks!
Now, before people start sharpening their pitchforks, let me explain. Because this story starts long before Marathon launch. It starts with Bungie, and it starts with Sony. Back in 2022, Sony acquired Bungie for $3.6 billion. And while nobody outside those companies knows every detail behind the deal, the timing was, interesting. Microsoft had just announced its acquisition of Activision Blizzard. I don't know about you, but I think a lot of this was a whim. Sony suddenly found itself without a major live service studio under its control. Then Bungie entered the picture, the creators of Halo, the creators of Destiny, one of the most experienced multiplayer studios in the world, and suddenly Sony had its answer. The problem is that live service games are expensive. Very expensive. Nothing against Fortnite, but I will still say that not of all its impact was for the better. Every publisher wants the next Fortnite, the next Roblox, the next game that prints money for 10 years. But those games are the exception, not the rule. For every Fortnite, there are dozens of projects that never reach those heights. And that's why Marathon is so fascinating, because this isn't some unknown developer. This is Bungie, a studio with decades of experience, a studio that helped define online shooters. Yet even they discovered that success isn't guaranteed. In fact, Sony later reported an impairment loss of roughly $765 million connected to Bungie's performance. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean Sony literally lost $765 million in cash. What it means is that Sony re-evaluated Bungie's valuing and concluded that some of the they acquired were worth less than originally expected, and Sony specifically linked those concerns to Bungie's overall performance, including Destiny 2 and Marathon. That's a serious number. At some point, Marathon stopped looking like a game and started looking like a very expensive lesson. A lesson that cost billions to acquire, hundreds of millions to develop, and apparently hundreds of millions more to reconsider. Now here's where I think Bungie made a mistake. Not because Marathon is an extraction shooter, not because the gameplay is bad, and not because nobody likes it. Clearly some people do. The mistake was assuming the Bungie name will be enough. There are those who could promote anything and will sell no matter what, like others. I think Bungie underestimated how much players wanted something else. Maybe Destiny 3, maybe a traditional Marathon reboot, maybe something closer to the classic games. Whatever it was, I don't think that was what many people expected. And that's important. Because players today have more choices than ever before. Being made by Bungie isn't enough. Being made by Blizzard isn't enough. Being made by Ubisoft isn't enough. The game itself has to convince people. One comparison people constantly bring up is Path of Exile 2. Now, I'm not saying that Marathon should have Path of Exile 2's numbers. They're completely different games. But What Path of Exile 2 demonstrates is that players will absolutely show up when they're excited. Excitement matters, interest matters, momentum matters, and that's where Marathon seems to struggle. When the game was first revealed, there was curiosity. People wanted to know what Bungie was cooking. Then gameplay arrived, the characters arrived, the art direction arrived, and suddenly the conversation changed. Not because the game looked terrible, but because many players simply weren't interested. And that's a dangerous place for any live service game to be. Because unlike a single player game, these games survive on population. They survive on momentum. They survive on people showing up every day. And that's why making Marathon free to play for only 1 week feels strange. It brought players back, but only temporarily. Maybe making it permanently free to play would help. Maybe a massive expansion will help. Maybe future updates completely transform the game. And I also think it was a bad decision to release one last update to Destiny 2. Games have recovered before. Final Fantasy XIV is proof of that. Nothing is written in stone. And for the record, I don't want Bungie to fail. I don't want people losing their jobs. I don't want another studio disappearing. Because despite all the criticism, Bungie has contributed too much to gaming history for anyone to celebrate that outcome. But I do think there are lessons here. About expectations, about live service games, about spending enormous amounts of money, chasing the next Fortnite. And maybe the biggest lesson is this. Players are smarter than companies. Sometimes give them credit for. They know what they want, they know when they're excited, and they know when they aren't. Maybe Marathon still has a future. Maybe Bungie turns everything around, or maybe this becomes another example of a publisher learning that nostalgia alone isn't enough to revive a franchise. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? If you were running Bungie right now, what would you do? If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribe, share, like, and comment. That helps me a lot. I'll see you next time.